I'm giving away a copy of Absolute Recoil, and at some point in this video, I'm going to explain how you can have a chance to win it. Slavoj Žižek is well known for his willingness to engage with Christianity. In fact, he calls himself a Christian atheist. Part of his Christian atheist theology is his novel reading of the fall of man as described in chapter 3 of the book of Genesis. Rather than interpreting the fall as the fall from a harmonious spiritual world, Žižek interprets it as the very genesis of spirit and the spiritual world, or subjectivity and culture. As a good Hegelian, Žižek affirms the necessity of negativity, the fact that spirit wins its truth only by looking the negative in the face and tarrying with it. The subject is self-relating negativity, and the fall is the primordial gesture of this self-relating, which Žižek refers to as absolute recoil. The innermost core of subjectivity resides in a unique act of what Fichte baptized self-positing. Here, each subject is a point of absolute autonomy, which means that it cannot be reduced to a moment in the network of causes and effects. In an act of self-relating that Hegel called absolute recoil, it has to posit retroactively the very causes of its existence. What Žižek means by retroactivity in this context is the fact that the subject posits itself, yet doesn't pre-exist its self-positing. So it's the cause of itself, yet in traditional logic, the cause must pre-exist that which it causes. But this paradoxically doesn't apply to the subject, and Žižek affirms this paradox. But he doesn't do so in a strictly Fichtean way, because for Fichte, the ego produces itself and all of its representational content through its act of self-positing. But Žižek's subject is not the ego, it's the unconscious of psychoanalysis, that which is always already presupposed by the conscious ego. Absolute recoil, as the negative withdrawal from the harmonious order of nature and into the self, is an unconscious act. Quote, "This notion of unconscious reflexivity also resolves the problem of endless regress in grounding a normative order or self-consciousness. The solution is not the Fichtean one, although it's strictly homologous to it. The solution is that this act of self-positing, the act through which, as Lacan put it, the subject acts as its own cause, is unconscious, always already presupposed by the conscious ego." The problem of the endless regress that Žižek claims unconscious reflexivity resolves is dealt with in detail in my video Consciousness is Unconscious. The reason why consciousness at its core is unconscious is due to the fact that there must be a point which is the origin or source of consciousness, one that cannot be included in it, or else we end up with an infinite regress. This unconscious point is the subject, which again is not the ego, but a purely negative entity without positive content. So, to be clear, Žižek interprets the fall as the moment when this negative entity comes into being through the self-positing act of absolute recoil. It's the origin of the unconscious, but it's also the origin of the imagination. In order to understand this, we must refer to Žižek's interpretation of Objet in relation to the subject. As we discussed in our video on this topic, Objet is produced as a result of the subject's failure to represent itself or self-relate. As Žižek puts it, the subject endeavors to represent itself adequately, this representation fails, and the subject is the result of this failure. There always is a gap in the field of representation, and that gap is the subject, which can never be included in it. This gap or negativity is filled in or positivized by the objet and it has no positive substantial being of its own. It's nothing but the positivization of a lack, not a lacking object, but an object which positivizes a lack, whose positivity is nothing but a positivized negativity. It's here that imagination enters. This positivization of a lack is the zero-level imagination. At its most radical ontological level, imagination notion fills in the void or lack that is the subject. That is, what the subject originally imagines is its own objectal counterpoint, itself as a determinate being. The objet is the subject, and the subject is a pure appearance with no substantial being. It's the product of the failure of self-relating negativity. It's what fills the gap or void of the subject's negativity. So for Žižek, the fall is the moment of self-relating that fails, hence it is fallen, but it's through its very fallenness that the subject emerges as a determinate being in the form of objet A. Thus, through the fall, the subject is created. It creates what it falls into. The subject is thus not just caught in the reflexivity of absolute recoil, it is nothing but this reflexivity. As the genesis of subjectivity, the fall is a precondition of freedom, because prior to it there is simply deterministic nature. The fall is, in fact, a precondition of all conscious experience. Thus, it's not that the fall is followed by redemption. The fall is identical to redemption. It is in itself already redemption. That's to say, what is redemption? The explosion of freedom, the breaking out of natural enchainment. And this precisely is what happens in the fall. One should bear in mind here the central tension of the Christian notion of the fall. The fall is stricto sensu identical with the dimension from which we fall, i.e., it is the very movement of the fall that creates, opens up what is lost in it. One may be tempted to say that the dimension from which we fell is some harmonious spiritual world. But spirit emerges through the fall and is thus always already alienated, so that any notion of some pre-existing harmony is pure fantasy. Hi, sorry to interrupt. So the giveaway for the Absolute Recoil book is being done in the Telos Bound Discord server, so just join the server and you can have a chance to win it. Now, Žižek affirms the traditional Christian notion that the fall is a fall into evil, precisely because it's the genesis of subjectivity. The nature of the subject is to abstract, negate, and divide. It breaks apart the substantial unity of the natural world. It disrupts peace and harmony. But Žižek's point is that it's this very evil that makes us free, and hence images of God. Quote, "In short, what makes us divine is our very fall into evil, since thinking is both at the same time evil and reconciliation. Hegel is clear here. Thinking not only opens up the choice between good and evil, thinking as such is evil, since the reflexivity that it implies makes it operate at a distance from immediate substantial unity. When we think, we abstract, we tear up the unity of the object of thought. Simultaneously, this reflexive distance implied in thinking implies freedom." Now, at this point, you may want to point out that the fall narrative isn't unique to Christianity. So you may be asking why Žižek is a Christian atheist. Well, Žižek sees something unique in the Christian story that he doesn't see in Judaism, for example. What Žižek sees in Christianity is not simply an account of the fall of man, but the identification of the fall with divinity itself. For Žižek, the death of Christ on the cross and what seems to be his division from God the Father is the first time in the history of religion that substance is revealed as subject. It's the moment when any notion of some harmonious and transcendent order behind the suffering and alienation of this world is revealed as a fantasy, because God himself, the ultimate substance, is self-divided. Hence, there's no possible return to unity, no reconciliation with God in the sense of returning to a paradise free from negativity and alienation. On the contrary, reconciliation with God involves a reconciliation with the necessity of negativity and alienation, because it's through embracing this necessity that we identify with Christ on the cross. In Christianity, God in a way repeats Adam and Eve's fall on himself. He falls from himself. He becomes a finite, mortal human abandoned by God in the figure of Christ and his lament on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And man can only achieve unity with God by identifying with this God, God abandoned by itself. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Please consider supporting me on Patreon. I make videos every 2 days on really any topic that I find interesting. That's all I have for today. Thank you again for watching, and may God bless you all.